There is a stretch of road in Yonkers, New York, where the streetlights seem to cast longer shadows than anywhere else. A neighborhood of narrow apartment buildings and cracked sidewalks where families lived stacked on top of one another, close enough to hear each other's arguments through the walls. Close enough, perhaps, to hear something terrible. And yet on the afternoon of March 9th, 1997, nobody heard a thing. Nobody came running. Nobody called for help. By the time anyone thought to check on the young mother living in the second-floor apartment at 98 Collins Street, it was already far too late. This is the story of Nusinaida Ramos, a woman who came to this country looking for a better life, only to find that the greatest danger she would ever face was not the unfamiliar streets of a new city, but the man she had once trusted with her heart. Yonkers sits just north of the Bronx, a city of hills and river views that has always lived in the shadow of New York City proper. In the 1990s, it was a place of contradictions. There were pockets of wealth along the waterfront, grand old neighborhoods with their manicured lawns and iron gates. But there were also neighborhoods like the one around Collins Street, where the paint peeled from the walls and the hallways smelled of cooking oil and cigarette smoke, where immigrant families scraped together rent money and hoped that this month would be a little easier than the last. It was the kind of neighborhood where people minded their own business, not out of indifference, but out of survival. You kept your head down, locked your door. You prayed that the trouble outside would stay outside. Nusinaida Ramos lived in one of these apartments. She was 34 years old. She was an immigrant from the Dominican Republic, a woman described by those who knew her as vibrant and beautiful, someone who could walk into a room and make everyone in it laugh, no matter how heavy the world felt outside. She had that rare gift, the kind of warmth that makes people feel safe, the kind that makes people lean a little closer when she spoke. Her sister-in-law, Eva Beauchamps, would later recall the way Nusinaida could light up a room, the way her laughter was infectious, the way she carried herself with a dignity that belied the difficulties of her circumstances. She was also a mother. She had two young children, a 4-year-old son and a 3-year-old daughter, and they were the center of her entire world. She lived with them in that second-floor apartment on Collins Street, doing her best to raise them on her own. Because by 1997, Nusinaida was separated from her husband, a man named Rafael Ramos, and if you understand nothing else about this story, understand this. That separation was not a small thing. It was an act of courage. It was a woman drawing a line and saying, no more. Rafael Ramos was a corrections officer at Sing Sing, one of the most infamous prisons in the state of New York. Sing Sing sits on the banks of the Hudson River in Ossining, a fortress of concrete and razor wire that has housed some of the most dangerous criminals in American history. To work there is to exist in a world defined by power and submission, by the constant awareness that control is the only thing standing between order and chaos. Rafael was a man accustomed to that kind of authority, accustomed to giving orders and having them followed, accustomed to being on the side of the wall where the door is locked from the outside. And when Nusinaida left him, when she took those children and built a life without him, something inside Rafael began to curdle into something dark, because Nusinaida was not simply moving on. She was making demands. She wanted more child support. She needed more money to take care of the two children they shared. And she was considering something that must have felt to a man like Rafael, like the ultimate act of defiance. She was thinking about moving to Florida. She was thinking about taking those children hundreds of miles away from him, out of his reach, out of his orbit, and that thought, that possibility, made Rafael Ramos extremely angry. On March 9th, 1997, the children were with Rafael. He had brought them to the Bronx, where he was staying with his new girlfriend. At some point that afternoon, Rafael drove to Yonkers. He would later admit that he went to the apartment on Collins Street. He said he needed to use the bathroom. He said he was there only briefly, just long enough to collect some of the children's belongings. His girlfriend and the children, he claimed, waited in the car outside the building. But that is where Rafael's version of events stops making sense. Because what happened inside that apartment was not a man stopping by to pick up a few toys. What happened was brutal, savage, and deeply personal. The prosecutors would later describe it as a vendetta, a very personal vendetta. The kind of violence that comes not from a stranger, not from a random act, but from someone who knows exactly where to direct their rage. When police arrived at 98 Collins Street the following day, March 10th, They found Nusinaida on the floor of her living room. She was wearing a t-shirt and shorts. The apartment around her told the story of what had happened. The furniture was in disarray, overturned and scattered, evidence of a violent and desperate struggle. Near her body, officers found 3 broken fingernails, torn from her hands as she fought for her life. She had been beaten until she bled. And then, when she could fight no more, the t-shirt had been twisted around her neck and pulled tight until the life left her body. The medical examiner would confirm what the scene already made clear. Nusinaida Ramos had been strangled to death. There was something else at the scene, something that would become one of the most significant pieces of physical evidence in the entire case. Beneath Nusinaida's body, investigators found a broken watch. It did not belong to her. Think about that for a moment. A watch broken during a struggle, trapped beneath the weight of the woman who had just been killed. It was the kind of detail that screamed intimacy, that suggested the killer had been close enough, physical enough, violent enough for a personal item to come loose and end up pinned under the victim's body. There were also signs that someone had attempted to clean the blood from the floor with a mop. Whoever had done this had tried, in some crude and panicked way, to erase the evidence of what they had done. But blood is not so easily erased. It seeps into the cracks between floorboards. It stains the grout between tiles. And no amount of frantic mopping can undo the kind of violence that was inflicted in that apartment. The body was not discovered until March 10th. Nusinaida's family had been trying to reach her by phone, but nobody answered. Growing worried, they contacted the Yonkers Police Department and requested a welfare check. When officers entered the apartment and found her lying on that living room floor, a murder investigation began. And from the very beginning, detectives had a name in their minds, Rafael Ramos. But suspicion and proof are 2 very different things. The original lead detective on the case, Christopher Deering, and the original prosecutor, Steven Vandervelden, hit an early wall. Rafael had an alibi. His girlfriend told investigators that he had been with her the entire afternoon. He had never left her side, she said. He was with the children. He was with her. There was no window of time in which he could have driven to Yonkers, killed his estranged wife, attempted to clean the scene, and returned without anyone noticing. It was a convincing story, convenient, airtight, and delivered without hesitation. And because of it, the investigation stalled. Without a way to place Rafael at the scene during the time of the murder, detectives had no case. Other leads were pursued, other possibilities explored, other names considered and discarded, but the case never gained the momentum it needed. The physical evidence was suggestive, but not conclusive. The broken watch had not yet been linked to Rafael through any definitive means. The mop suggested a cleanup, but could not tell detectives who had held it. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. Months turned into years. And the murder of Nusinaida Ramos settled into the worst kind of limbo, an unsolved case. A cold case. A case that sat in a filing cabinet while the world outside kept moving. While her children grew up without their mother. While her family waited for answers that never came. While the man detectives suspected walked the corridors of Sing Sing every day, enforcing the law for others while evading it himself. Rafael Ramos continued his life. He kept working at Sing Sing, though he would eventually be fired in 2003 after 9 years on the job. He moved to Sleepy Hollow, that quiet village just up the river, a place known more for its literary ghosts than its real ones. He raised children. He walked free. And for over 2 decades, it seemed as though he might walk free forever. But time has a way of unraveling lies, and the lie that had protected Rafael Ramos for all those years had a fatal flaw. It depended entirely on one person's willingness to keep telling it. In 2006, 9 years after the murder, Rafael's former girlfriend made a decision that would change everything. The relationship between them had ended. Whatever loyalty or fear or love had kept her silent had finally dissolved. And she came forward, under oath, and told a very different story. She testified that on the afternoon of March 9th, 1997, Rafael had not been with her the entire time. He had left. He had left her alone with the children in the Bronx for over 90 minutes. 90 minutes. More than enough time to drive to Yonkers, commit a murder, attempt a hasty cleanup, and return. The alibi was gone. But even with this recantation, the case did not immediately spring back to life. The criminal justice system moves slowly, and cold cases move slowest of all. The original detective had moved on. The original prosecutor had moved on. The evidence was aging, the witnesses were aging, and the institutional memory of the case was fading with every passing year. It would take another 15 years and a fundamental change in how Westchester County approached unsolved murders before the wheels of justice finally began to turn. In 2021, Westchester County District Attorney Miriam Roca established a dedicated cold case bureau. It was an acknowledgement that cases like this one, cases where the evidence existed, but the momentum had been lost, deserved another look. Criminal investigator James Menton was assigned to the Ramos case, working alongside Yonkers Police Department cold case detectives John Geis and Vianette Martinez. They went back to the beginning. They re-examined every piece of evidence. They tracked down witnesses. They applied modern forensic techniques to evidence that had been collected over 2 decades earlier. Advanced DNA testing was performed on the t-shirt that had been used to strangle Nusinaida. The results were both revealing and complicated. The DNA testing identified 2 unknown male profiles on the victim's shirt. But here is the thing that made this case so challenging for prosecutors. Rafael Ramos was ruled out as the source of that DNA. The shirt that had killed her carried genetic material from someone, but not from the man everyone believed had done it. Additional testing on the broken watch found beneath the body detected no DNA at all. It was the kind of evidence that might have ended another investigation. But the prosecutors in the Cold Case Bureau, led by Chief Daniel Fletcher, were not deterred. They believed that the totality of the evidence, the recanted alibi, the broken watch, the signs of a cleanup, the motive, the history of anger and control, all of it painted a picture that DNA alone could neither confirm nor erase. On June 14th, 2023, more than 26 years after Nusinaida Ramos was murdered, Yonkers police arrested Rafael Ramos at his home in Sleepy Hollow. He was 54 years old. He was arraigned that same day before Judge George Fufidio in Westchester County Court and remanded into custody. The following day, a Westchester County grand jury indicted him on a single count of murder in the 2nd degree. The arrest sent ripples through the community. Eva Beauchamps, Nusinaida's sister-in-law, spoke about the woman they had lost. She called her vibrant. She called her beautiful. She spoke about the laughter, about the warmth, about all the things that had been taken from the world on that afternoon in March. And she spoke about the anger, about how Rafael had been furious over the child support demands, furious over the possibility of Florida, furious enough, she believed, to kill. But the legal road ahead would prove anything but straightforward. Judge Fufidio reviewed the original grand jury presentation and found it troubling, calling it replete with hearsay evidence. A new indictment was issued in December 2023, again charging 2nd-degree murder. The judge entered a not guilty plea on Rafael's behalf and set bail at $750,000 cash, $1 million bond, or $2 million partially secured bond. The defense, led by attorney Linda Visco, mounted a vigorous challenge. She argued that the 26-year delay had denied her client his right to a fair trial. She pointed to the DNA evidence that excluded him. She characterized the prosecution's star witness, the ex-girlfriend, as a woman scorned, someone who had fabricated her recantation out of bitterness over their breakup. She noted that Rafael had previously passed a polygraph test and had voluntarily offered his DNA for comparison. He had stayed in the area for decades, never fleeing, never hiding, living his life in plain sight just miles from where the murder occurred. But the prosecution held firm. They argued the delay was excusable, that the case had been hampered by the original alibi, and that good faith efforts had been made throughout. Judge Fufidio agreed, denying the defense motion to dismiss. In September of 2024, jury selection began. 27 years after Nusinaida Ramos took her last breath on the floor of her living room, the man accused of killing her was finally facing a jury of his peers. The trial would force 12 strangers to weigh evidence that was nearly 3 decades old, to evaluate the credibility of witnesses whose memories had been shaped and reshaped by the passage of time, and to decide whether the circumstantial threads of this case, woven together, formed a rope strong enough to convict. The prosecution laid out their case methodically. They spoke of a man consumed by rage over child support demands and the threat of losing proximity to his children. They presented the timeline, the 90-minute window that the ex-girlfriend's recantation had opened. They showed the jury photos of the crime scene, the overturned furniture, the broken fingernails, the mop left behind. They spoke of the watch found beneath the body. And they asked the jury to consider the totality of it all, to see the pattern that emerged when every piece was placed beside the next. The defense countered with equal force. They pointed to the DNA evidence that excluded Raphael. They questioned the reliability of a witness who had changed her story only after a bitter breakup. They reminded the jury that their client had cooperated with police, had passed a polygraph, had offered his DNA willingly. They argued that 27 years of freedom was not evidence of guilt, but evidence of innocence. There are cases in the annals of criminal justice that remind us how fragile the pursuit of truth can be. Cases where the evidence is circumstantial, where the science raises as many questions as it answers, where the passage of time threatens to wash away any hope of resolution. This is one of those cases. What we know is this: a young mother was murdered in her own home. She was beaten and strangled while her children were elsewhere, unaware that they would never see her again. The furniture was overturned. Her fingernails were broken. She fought. She fought as hard as she could, and it was not enough. We know that her estranged husband admitted being in that apartment on the day she died. We know that his watch was found beneath her body. We know that someone tried to clean up the blood. We know that his alibi collapsed under oath. And we know that for 26 years, while those two children grew up without their mother, nobody was held accountable for her death. Think about those two children. A 4-year-old boy and a 3-year-old girl who went to spend time with their father on a Sunday afternoon and came home to find that their mother was gone forever. They were too young to understand what had happened, too young to process the enormity of the loss, but they would grow up in its shadow. They would grow up with questions that had no answers, with a void where a mother's love should have been, with the knowledge that the person who was supposed to protect them from the world had been taken from it in the most violent way imaginable. Whatever the outcome of this trial, whatever verdict the jury reaches, nothing can give those children back what was stolen from them on that March afternoon. The streets of Yonkers have changed since 1997. Buildings have been renovated, businesses have come and gone, families have moved in and moved out. But at 98 Collins Street, the walls still stand. If walls could speak, they would tell you what happened on that afternoon in March. They would tell you about the sounds of a struggle, about the breaking of furniture and the breaking of fingernails, about the terrible silence that followed. They would tell you about Nusinaida Ramos, a woman who came to this country with nothing but hope, who loved her children more than anything in this world, and who died in the one place she should have been safest. Rest in peace, Nusinaida. You deserved so much more than this world gave you.